The moment of truth for the Japanese Imperial Army was the sound of a standard American machine gun not bouncing off their tank armor, but punching straight through it. Japanese tank crews were dangerously wrong about their equipment. They believed their Type 95 Hago tanks were invincible, a proven force against Chinese armies, Soviet armor at Khalkhin Gol, and in the swift early victories across Malaya and the Philippines. For years, Japanese soldiers were convinced these light tanks represented the pinnacle of armored warfare design, perfectly suited for the challenging jungles and islands of the Pacific. Their devastating realization began not with defeat, but with a confidence born from years of unchecked success. The Ha-Go was the product of careful military planning. Starting in 1933, the Japanese Imperial Army identified a critical need. Their main tank, the Type 89 Medium, could only manage 15 miles per hour. This was far too slow for the mechanized warfare they foresaw. Military planners wanted a vehicle that could keep pace with motorized infantry, navigate the terrain of Manchuria and China, and be mass-produced within Japan's industrial capacity. The Army Technical Bureau laid out specifications for a 7-ton tank with a 37mm gun, capable of 40 kilometers per hour, and armored to resist rifle and machine gun fire. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries won the contract, and engineered Tomihara created a key innovation, the bell crank suspension system. By June 1934, the first prototype impressed observers during trials. It was fast, hitting up to 45 kilometers per hour on roads, and surprisingly maneuverable cross-country. The suspension system, though it led to a rough ride later dubbed the Manchurian suspension, effectively absorbed shocks, allowing it to traverse difficult terrain. The tank was also mechanically reliable, powered by a 120-horsepower air-cooled diesel engine. The use of diesel was a deliberate choice, making the vehicle less vulnerable to fire than gasoline tanks, and utilizing a more readily available fuel source across the empire. The Ha-Go could run for up to 10 hours on its internal fuel capacity. The Type 95 was officially proposed in 1935. While infantry representatives argued its 12mm armor was insufficient for attacking fortified positions, cavalry units insisted its superior speed and mobility compensated for the thin protection, arguing its firepower was adequate for its intended mission. After debate, the Type 95 Ha-Go, named for the 95th year since the legendary founding of Japan, was officially adopted. Production commenced at Mitsubishi facilities in 1936. The Ha-Go was small, just over 4 meters long, 2 meters wide, and barely 2 meters tall. Its armor was thin by any measure, a maximum of 12mm on the turret and upper hull, 9mm on the roof and floor, and 6mm in less critical areas. Designers believed this was adequate to stop rifle and machine gun bullets at combat ranges, designing specifically for the enemies they anticipated, Chinese forces with limited anti-tank capabilities and light Soviet tanks. The interior was notoriously cramped, housing a 3-man crew. The driver sat in the front left hull with minimal vision, while the hull machine gunner sat to his right, operating a Type 97 7.7mm machine gun. The commander occupied the turret alone, standing on the hull floor without a turret basket. The commander's job was impossibly difficult. He had to command the tank, directing the driver and coordinating with other tanks, though only 1 in 4 tanks had a radio. He also had to operate and load the main weapon, a Type 94 37mm cannon, and manage a second machine gun mounted in the rear of the turret. American tankers later expressed astonishment that a commander could function efficiently under such physically demanding conditions, having to stand throughout the combat and manually rotate the turret with significant effort. Despite these constraints, the Ha-Go excelled in its intended role. It first saw significant action in China starting in 1937, where the Chinese forces had virtually no armor and few anti-tank weapons. The Ha-Go's 37mm gun destroyed fortifications, its machine guns devastated infantry, and its mobility allowed it to exploit breakthroughs. Japanese crews gained immense confidence, learning their trade in an environment where their tanks were clearly superior. This success, however, led to a dangerous and ultimately fatal assumption that the Hago was genuinely capable against any foe, not just optimized for a specific, limited scenario. This confidence was first severely tested at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, during clashes with the Soviet Union. The Hago faced real opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks mounted 45mm guns that possessed better armor penetration than the Japanese 37mm gun. Moreover, their thicker armor made frontal engagements problematic for the Hago. While the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment initially achieved success, destroying 32 Soviet tanks, Soviet counterattacks quickly exposed the Hago's vulnerabilities. Soviet guns could penetrate the Hago's armor at ranges where the Japanese guns struggled to even damage the Soviet tanks. The campaign was a clear warning. The Hago was outmatched by modern Soviet armor, and its thin protection and weak gun were inadequate for peer-to-peer tank combat.
Crucially, these lessons were not fully applied. Japanese leadership focused on crew training and tactical improvements, not a fundamental redesign of their armored forces. The Hago remained effective in the ongoing war in China. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, Japanese tank units achieved remarkable success in Malaysia, navigating terrain the British thought impassable. In the Philippines, Type 95s engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks. While the M3 had superior armor, the Japanese achieved success at close range, reinforcing their confidence. Hago, from their perspective, was performing exactly as designed. This ingrained confidence led to a fateful decision at Saipan. The island was strategically vital, positioning American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands if captured. The Japanese forces fortified the island with 30,000 troops, including the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Goto, which contained 44 tanks, mostly Type 95 Hagos and some Type 97 Chihas. This represented the largest armored force the Americans had yet encountered in the Pacific. The American assault began on June 15, 1944. By nightfall, 20,000 American troops were ashore, establishing a beachhead supported by M4 Sherman medium tanks. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the Japanese forces, urgently ordered a major counterattack before the Americans could consolidate. The plan involved infantry from the 136th Regiment assaulting positions near the airfield, followed by Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment charging the transmitting station to sow disorder. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, the 44 tank column moved out, their engines and tracks echoing across the landscape. The crews, many of them veterans, were confident in their machines and tactics. The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries reported the sounds, and men scrambled to man their anti-tank guns and M4 Sherman tanks. At 3:30 in the morning, the attack began. As the tanks advanced, the Marines opened fire. However, the first wave of destruction did not come from the 37mm anti-tank guns or the Sherman 75mm cannons. It came from the Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were 50 caliber weapons, standard issue for engaging aircraft and light vehicles, firing a 12.7mm round at over 2,900 feet per second. Critically, its armor-piercing rounds were designed to penetrate 23 millimeters of face-hardened steel armor plate at 200 meters. The physics were uncompromising. The Type 95 Hago's armor maxed out at 12 millimeters. Simple arithmetic showed the .5 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate nearly double that thickness at close range. At the battle ranges of 200 meters or less, the .5 caliber had more than enough penetrating power. When the Marines opened fire, the result shocked both sides. The .5 caliber rounds did not simply dent the tanks, they penetrated cleanly and decisively. At close range, some rounds were reported to have gone completely through the thin armor, entering one side and exiting the other. Inside the cramped Hago, the machine gun fire was not just a loud impact, It was penetration. There was no safe place for the crew. A round could strike engine components, ammunition racks, or, most terrifyingly, the crew members. The face-hardened armor, which was designed to resist rifle fire, offered no meaningful protection against the heavy .5 caliber rounds. Marines reported seeing their tracer rounds hit an advancing Hago, followed by sparks inside the tank visible through the vision ports. The tank would slow, then stop, and engine smoke would pour out. Another Marine gunner recounted firing a sustained burst into a Hago's side, seeing the commander slump forward after a bullet went through the thin turret armor. The realization was devastating for the surviving Japanese crews. Their tanks, which they had trusted with their lives in China and Malaysia, offered no protection against American infantry support weapons. A captured Japanese tank officer could not accept the reality, suggesting the Americans must have developed some secret advanced ammunition. He could not believe that a conventional heavy machine gun could defeat a tank. The Browning M2, however, was in an entirely different league than anything the Japanese had faced before. With armor-piercing rounds, it possessed the energy to defeat 12mm armor at all practical combat ranges. As the Japanese tank attack faltered, American M4 Sherman medium tanks moved forward to complete the rout. The contrast was stark. The Hago weighed 7.4 tons. The Sherman weighed 31.8 tons. The Hago had 12 millimeters of armor. The Sherman had 51 millimeters on the frontal hull, angled to provide protection equivalent to about 75 millimeters. The Sherman's main armament was a 75mm gun, which could penetrate the Hago's armor from over a mile away. When the Shermans opened fire, the Japanese tanks were instantly annihilated. Japanese return fire from the 37 and 57mm rounds was completely ineffective against the Sherman's frontal armor, often bouncing off or leaving only small dents. The battlefield became a chaotic scene of noise, tracers, and burning wrecks. By mid-morning on June 17th, the Japanese counterattack had collapsed. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the landscape. For the Marines surveying the wreckage, a new tactical understanding emerged. An officer noted the clean, round holes punched through the Hago's armor where the .5 caliber bullets had entered. Everything about the Hago was crude by American standards and hopelessly vulnerable to .5 caliber fire. They looked exactly like what they were, light tanks from the mid-1930s designed for colonial conflicts, yet utterly inadequate for modern industrial warfare against a peer adversary.
The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese crews was profound. The equipment they had relied upon offered no protection against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. Prisoners of war expressed consistent shock at American firepower, and often a feeling of betrayal that their leaders had sent them into battle with such inadequate equipment. One veteran tanker admitted that after seeing his tank penetrated by machine gun fire and watching Shermans shrug off Japanese anti-tank rounds, he realized that fighting spirit could not overcome such fundamental material disadvantages. The key lesson for the Marines was simple and immediate. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, specifically the .50 caliber machine gun, were effective against them. The fear of facing Japanese armor evaporated. The Battle of Saipan continued, declared secure on July 9, 1944. The victory had immense strategic consequences, placing American B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. And the psychological impact on Japanese leadership was so severe that it led to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's resignation. For Japanese tank crews across the Pacific, Saipan was the undeniable turning point. They knew their equipment was inadequate, yet there was nothing they could do. Japan's industrial capacity, strained by years of war and resource scarcity, simply could not produce modern tanks in meaningful numbers. While engineers had designed superior models, like the Type 3 Chinu, they remained largely prototypes, save for the defense of the Japanese home islands. Meanwhile, American production capacity was staggering. The Detroit Tank Arsenal alone produced 97 Sherman tanks in a single month in late 1942, more than Japan produced in an entire year. Over 10 major American manufacturers contributed to Sherman production, an industrial mobilization on an unprecedented scale. By the end of the war, American factories had built over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Japan, by contrast, produced approximately 2,300 Hagos from 1936 to 1943, a ratio of more than 20 to 1. The Sherman tanks were individually far more capable. Weighing over 30 tons, they had armor ranging from 51 to 76 millimeters. They carried a 5-man crew with dedicated roles, featured gyro-stabilized guns, and had radio equipment in every tank for coordinated operations. In the Pacific, where it faced tanks designed in the mid-1930s, the Sherman was overwhelmingly superior. The pattern established at Saipan repeated itself across subsequent island battles. On Peleliu and Iwo Jima, Japanese tanks were often dug into caves or buried up to their turrets, used as stationary pillboxes. This was a clear recognition that they had no chance in mobile warfare. Even as static positions, they remained vulnerable. .50 caliber machine guns could still penetrate the turret armor. The Hago, once a symbol of Japanese might, had become a metal coffin. At Okinawa, the final major battle, the Japanese committed 27 tanks against the Americans over 800, a disparity of more than 30 to 1, compounding the qualitative gap. A counteroffensive on May 4, 1945, failed catastrophically. Most of the Japanese tanks were destroyed within hours by Shermans, bazookas, anti-tank guns, artillery, and of course, the .50 caliber machine guns. The Japanese tank crew's experience in the final years of the war was one of a crushing, slow realization. The equipment they had trusted was fundamentally flawed. The moment of truth came not in an epic, decisive duel, but in the terrifying simplicity of watching standard machine gun bullets punch through the armor that was supposed to protect them. American engineers later confirmed the combat lessons upon examining captured Hagos at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. The armor thickness was minimal, and the metallurgy confirmed that the face-hardened steel was only effective against small arms fire, providing no defense against the larger, high-velocity .50 caliber projectiles. The most profound difference was not in a single design detail, but in the industrial systems that produced them. The U.S. economy could wage industrial warfare on a global scale, producing tanks at rates that seemed impossible in peacetime. Japan's economy was exhausted, its factories lacked the automation of American plants, and its vital resource supply lines were constantly cut off by American submarines. The Hago tanks and their brave, doomed crews represented the consequences of strategic decisions made years earlier. To assume that fighting spirit could compensate for material inferiority, and to prioritize a design optimized for the wars of the 1930s. When those first .50 caliber rounds punched through the Hago armor on Saipan, they proved that in industrial warfare between modern nations, production capacity, design philosophy, and resource allocation matter more than anything else. No amount of courage, training, or tactical skill could overcome a generational gap in equipment quality combined with a massive numerical disadvantage. The Japanese tank crews who climbed into their Hagos that morning in June 1944 believed they were going into battle with reliable, capable machines. By the time the sun set, those who survived knew the brutal truth. They had been given equipment so thin that a machine gun used for infantry support could defeat it. They had been sent to fight a global superpower with armor that was tragically obsolete.